So today I wanted to make a quick follow-up video on my previous one, which was on the idea of net decking versus creativity and where you have space and where you don't have space to make modifications to actual good players' decks without making your deck worse. I'm not going to go over things that I've already covered in that video, but just for context, I'll briefly explain that in the Runick White Forest version, you have to play 18 Runicks and 2 Fountains. That's basically standard for Runick decks that have in other engines. And a Stellar is way, way worse than every other White Forest card, because if you get Impermed or Veilered on the Stellar, you have nothing. But if you get Impermed or Veilered on the Sylvie or the Rusia, it doesn't matter because you just go through Hugin into your Arciela and you continue your ladder and you're fine. So in a resource-based deck, your ability to consistently cycle through your resources is what determines if you're going to win your games or not. So adding in cards like a Stellar, which normally don't punish you in other versions of this deck, like if you normal summon a Stellar and you send Soldier and they Imperm or Veiler, it does not matter at all because you're going to continue cycling through your engine through the toy cards. But when you don't have access to that and you're playing with a Runick engine, the piece that you ladder with is the Hugin. In rare case, it is also the Gary, but it's usually the Hugin. And so the Stellar is actually really not a good card in this deck. There are ways to play it, so I'm not saying that it's like permanently 100% wrong, but there also is very, very little space for the non-engine cards. I have opted to make certain modifications to Joshua Schmidt's list based on my locals and what I wanted to test. And Iris Sword Soul is my standard search off of Arciela. I don't like having Veiler as the target because it defeats the purpose of what Runick is supposed to do. Veiler is a net negative in terms of the overall card economy because you lose the card and your opponent keeps the card that was negated. Whereas what you're supposed to do with the Runick cards is you don't lose the card you use, you put it into your deck and then you draw cards. And so I felt like the Iris Sword Soul was the most natural complement to that type of game plan. I think that it is kind of hard to argue for this in other versions of the deck, even though the summoning condition is very easy to meet because in engine, you can usually just get the Rusia or the Sylvie onto the field and the effects are negated. And so it's also an easy way to play around breakers because you can keep the Rusia or the Sylvie in the grave, and after your opponent has started playing, the Iris Sword Soul that you search off of Arciela and you held, you can summon that whenever you want. And the draw 2 is extremely relevant in a Runick deck, and it really helps you continue grinding. So I really like this card in this deck. I play the GOAT because it's flexible on the dice roll. You can get it in the grave as early as the standby phase off of Hugin. And I opted to main the skill drain instead of the evenly, although I think these could be interchanged possibly. Okay, so let's go over matchups and how the matchups change a little bit in terms of how well you're likely to perform. I think that Yubel is usually the deck that you struggle with most in other versions of White Forest. And one of the main reasons is that Phantom of Yubel is very hard to play around, partly because if you read what it says here, this card is tributed as cost, and that makes it more awkward to interact with, but it only changes monster effects, and most of this deck is not monster effects. So if you have opened a Tip or a Flashing Fire or a Freezing Curses, then you can very, very easily play around Phantom of Yubel, and then ideally, you're also establishing a resource game off of Fountain. So this deck doesn't feel nearly as oppressive, especially if they don't know what you're doing. However, if they are playing Varudris, which is not in every single Yubel deck, then it does become a lot harder because they have much more effective ways to interact with you. But yeah, if they put up like multiple Phantoms of Yubel, then you have a much easier time at least deciding which lines you want to go for first. And so I think that this matchup is greatly improved. However, the Yubel Fiendsmith deck is just a better deck. So even though I would say it goes from being a bad matchup in principle to not a bad matchup anymore, it's still just a better deck. When it comes to the fire decks, so mostly just Fiends with Snake Eyes, I think that it's a very awkward matchup because the Desirae, this card is the way that they can negate evenly, and this is a card that will either be in your main or it will be in your side. So Joshua Schmidt main this card. And really the fire decks, the only way that they have for playing around that is Desirae. And if you draw access to Destruction and you get rid of the sequence so that the Desirae either has to let it happen and then the sequence goes and it has no more negation, or they chain the Desirae and they keep the sequence, but they've used the effect, then you can resolve evenly. That becomes a way easier matchup. If you were playing like a lot of the normal versions of White Forest where you're playing a lot of hand traps, you're not beating Snake Eyes Fiendsmith anyhow. If you're on a breaker build, it's a much easier matchup, but then you concede to worse decks like the FTK stuff like Gimmick Puppet or like Branded Locks and stuff like that. So it's kind of hard if you don't know exactly what your meta is like, determining between board breakers versus hand traps on the normal White Forest builds. And so whether or not playing the Runick version instead improves your matchup, I think kind of depends on if you're playing breakers or not. But yeah, generally speaking, evenly matched is your win condition against that deck, because it also hurts their resource game, and you have much more optimal ways of playing around other cards like Princess in the Grave or whatever. In terms of my most recent experiences at locals, I think the most annoying deck to play against is Ritual Beast, which I despise, and I hate that that is now a thing, because they take 7 years to do something that every other deck does in a single card effect. It's a very awkward matchup because there are a lot of things that you don't actually want to banish off the top of their deck because they can use those. And if you get lucky and you hit something like Steeds, then that's obviously good. So that feels kind of like dice rolly in terms of what you banish. And the Silvera is pretty much useless because they can still contact fuse with the face down materials. So I feel like part of your deck is just not very good against them, but you also have better ways of playing around the Protos, because like if they Protos and call Light and you're on a normal deck, because it's a lingering effect, you may just lose the game entirely because of that. Or you'll make some extremely inefficient play where you're trying to like SP remove the Protos so that you can play on the next turn and you're hoping to survive that long. But it's a lot easier when you have access to, for example, like freezing curses or other ways to get around the Protos. And yeah, so I feel like that matchup is kind of weird. When I faced off against that in my last locals, it was game 1 ended in time in battle phase, and I won dealing 100 life points attacking over something with Yubel. So yeah, those, I would say the Fiendsmith, Snake Eyes, and Yubel are obviously the top meta contenders. Against Tenpai, those matches feel very awkward because you do have lots of ways to interact with their deck. And I think it's probably better. It's probably a better matchup for us if we're on the Runick cards, because you also have stuff like Destruction or Searching Destruction off of tip for the field spell. And that completely changes how easy or hard the matchup is, because normally on a typical White Forest build, one of the things that you will often find yourself doing is that you bring out the Zapper Shrimp off of Diabel to get rid of the field spell, because otherwise you can't interact with them. And if they have a way to make Transcendent Dragion, then you just lose. But here you have an additional tool in the Runick Destruction. So you can either wait until they use the effect of Sanguine Summoning, and then you can just change Destruction and pop it. And if they somehow access another one that they want to use for protection, then you still have the Zapper Shrimp. So that kind of redundancy is very functional, and I feel like it improves the Tenpai matchup. But you know, Tenpai also, because they have Genroku now, they have multiple routes to OTK, or they have more routes to OTK compared to before. And so sometimes they can actually wait and hold out on the last card they need, because they often only need one card to kill you. So I feel like that matchup is very volatile, and you have to actually play perfectly. Like normally you have to play perfectly with Runick anyhow, because it's a low impact resource deck. But against Tenpai, the punishment for not playing perfectly is that you lose immediately. So yeah, that matchup feels very volatile. And then if they don't have access to stuff like Sanguine Summoning, it feels easier to deal with, because you can either remove their stuff in the main phase, or in the start step of battle before they're able to declare an attack or whatever, you can force them to synchro and then, you know, respond appropriately. Goat is pretty interesting against their deck, both the Grave effect and the on-field effect. But you have to remember that since we're now post-Infinite Forbidden, you can't just call Chandra and immediately win, because they can access Genroku as a tuner, and they can still go into Bident Dragion and then make like synchro plays and stuff. So you can't just like helmet use this card. But this is another tool that really helps against Tenpai. And I found that if you're really not sure what to call, or you feel like if you call Chandra, maybe they will like, if you were in battle phase, for example, have a Kaimin to chain to it or some other way to still get access to it. Or like maybe normal summon it from hand or something like that. You can just be safer and call the Biden Dragion and force them to go into an awkward play. So yeah. I would also generally say that skill drain is good against almost every deck. And it is so good that it is main worthy as well. I don't know if there are really any decks that it's not good against that are currently in the meta. So it feels like if you're going second, because you're trying to put at least some cracks in their board, you usually have space to set the skill drain and continue playing. So I feel like this card is good. And this helps with matchups. You obviously can main this in other versions of White Forest, but it doesn't stop you from doing any of your Runick plays. So, you know, it's just like as synergistic as it normally would be. Other than that, I don't think that there are too many decks that are worth talking about in the meta because it's mostly Snake Eyes, Yubel, and Tenpai based on representation that we've seen. There are decks that can be more awkward to interact with, like Memento, if they have the spells that will allow you to dodge stuff, or the Chimera cards, like if they chain Chimera Fusion to you trying to negate or pop a monster or whatever. Those types of interactions can be extremely damaging because, again, you're on a low impact resource-based deck, and the things that you do have to actually be impactful. And then against Chimera, you know, like if they get the Codal in the grave and stuff like that, and they can start negating your effects and not just dodging them, you're not in a good position. Yeah. The last thing I would say in terms of matchups is the siding patterns with this are kind of weird because the engine requirements are so steep. Like, basically everything above the bottom line, you can't really change because for the White Forest cards to work, they basically have to be at these ratios. You kind of need to keep in the tails and the woes. So there are really like 9 slots that you have for changing, which are these cards. And oftentimes you will want to put in evenly matched. There are very few times when you don't want to, if you know you're going to be going second. Or sometimes if you know that you might be going first against a degenerate Runick stun deck. The Bestials, I think, are a pretty solid addition as really good resource-based cards that don't just lose you a card. And this helps a lot against Yubel. It also generally helps against the Fiendsmith cards, but you have to be very careful because you have to remember that the Lacrima, so this card says if this card is fusion summoned, you can target one of your Light Fiend monsters that is banished or in your graveyard and add it to hand or special summon it. So you can't just preemptively helmet, use a Bestial, and banish the Engraver that they would have targeted. You have to wait until they target it, and then you can move it from the grave to banished, and then it is now treated as a different card because it moved location, and then the Lacrima will fizzle. Or there are like lots of other scenarios where you can't necessarily just preemptively use the Bestial. So you do have to think a little bit, but it's still good against the Fiendsmith stuff. And I feel like almost everyone is playing these cards. The Bestials are generally solid options, especially if you feel like maybe the skill drain isn't something that's worth keeping in or the talents isn't going to be super optimal. I usually side out the Irish Sword Soul going second because I feel like there's no room for drawing something that isn't very high impact going second when you're not even playing anything to interrupt their board. And now that they know what you're playing and they know that you're not on any hand traps at all, they can make whatever board they want. So usually this will come out, and then unless I think the goat is particularly useful, this will also come out. Against Tenpai, I put in Ash, but I usually feel like this is low impact enough that I won't side it. Called By is pretty good against a lot of things in the meta. So even though in previous metas this could be considered a Saki one-of, in this case I feel like it's more like it contributes to solid ratios combined with putting in stuff like Bestials, so you can hit Fiendsmith cards, which you're not playing, which means you're not cutting yourself off by using Called By. It's good against Tenpai, it helps stop you being OTK'd. Yeah. And then the Phantasme, I think, is a really good card for what this deck is trying to do, which is draw cards and not lose resources. So I would play this against every single deck that is going to make a Link Summon. If you're playing against Tenpai and you know that you're going to choose to go second, or you think they may choose to go first, this is always going to resolve against the Seals. Basically, every Fiendsmith deck that exists is going to make Sequence or at least Requiem. So this is basically like an insane side deck card for us. I would never ever play this deck without siding this card, and that makes certain cards like Evenly and Lightning Storm a little bit more awkward. But I've found that there are actually decent ways to play around it, or to force them to get rid of this card, or to like go battle phase, run into something that's in attack position, and then evenly matched. So yeah, and then obviously the Moonin is there for a time. So that's my experience so far. Let me know if you have any comments below. There's also a Discord. I will put the link to join that in the description below. And thanks for watching.